Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the world to the Enlightenment Podcast. It is a critical time in the world, when isn't it? But it feels more this time. And we feel it's important to have a meaningful dialogue on Palestine, offering context that is often absent from mainstream media and highlighting the rich traditions, culture, and history of Palestine. Today, we are thrilled to discuss not just Palestine, but the beauty and the importance of Palestinian and Arabic poetry to Palestinian culture and resistance with our very special guest, Atef Alshaer. Welcome to the Enlightenment Podcast, Atef.
Thank you very much.
Atef, it was so good to see you last week in London. Shamim and I are very excited to have you here today. Thank you.
I'm very excited to speak to you. Thank you so much.
Well, for those of you who are unfamiliar, Dr. Atef Alshaer is an associate professor in Arabic and cultural studies at the University of Westminster in London. He completed his English language and literature degree at Birzeit University in Palestine and his master's and PhD from SOAS at the University of London. He's the author of several papers and books, including Poetry and Politics in the Modern Arab World, A Map of Absence, an anthology of Palestinian writing on the Nakba, and Out of Gaza, New Palestinian Poetry, which won the Palestine Book Award in 2024. So congratulations on that. Hanan, let me start with our familiar question. How do you know Atef? Is he the product of several of your grandmothers or a cousin or not?
Well, if we look deep enough, we'll probably all be related as Palestinians. But no, Atef and I have a dear friend, Dr. Najat, and also Atef went to university with Dr. Najat and my cousin Victor Kattan, who we did a podcast with. And I just want to mention that Atef's last name in Arabic, Alshaer, I know you haven't pronounced it correctly, Shamim, but that's okay. It means the poet. So Atef, I think it's probably meant that you've become a poet.
Well, it's an accident, but or I tried to be. But well, the Sha'ar is my family name, which is really what it is, and it's kind of a big family. You know, it's you find it in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan, in Egypt, in much of the Arab world. It's quite a common family name. But it happens that I'm also interested in poetry, so it's a kind of an interesting coincidence. You know, in Arabic they say لكل من اسمه نصيب, يعني each has a share of their name, and it seems that it's worked quite a bit in my case.
Yeah, there's probably another conversation for another podcast about how much we're influenced by our names growing up. You know,
yes.
has something. But Atef, I grew up studying English literature, you know, the Western canon, because other languages and cultures were very few and far between at that time, especially Arabic poetry. Can you tell us something about the Arabic poetry tradition in general, but Palestine in particular? You know, starting with maybe what are the earliest or best known written poems from Palestinian poetry?
Well, I mean, Arabic poetry is really, it belongs to an incredible tradition which goes back all the way to about the 4th century AD. So it's quite a long and old and extraordinary, vast tradition. And it really sort of begins in the linguistic sense, the Arabic, or what we might call the Arabic civilization, which later becomes the Arabic and Islamic civilization. So Arabic poetry is, in the case of the Arab word, is sort of the foundational source of Arabic civilization, stretching all the way back from the 4th, 5th, 6th century up to the arrival of Islam in the 7th century. But coming forward to the Palestinian poetry is part of that tradition, in the sense that it was composed in Arabic, and we start to get, like, in terms of national traditions in the Arab world, like each country, with the rise of the nation state in the 19th century, in particular after colonialism, you start to get national traditions, poetic and literary traditions in general. But still, it belongs to the broader Arabic tradition, which is called Arabic literature. And that can be Egyptian, can be Palestinian, can be Iraqi. But the Palestinian tradition in particular, the Palestinian poetic tradition in particular, is linked to the colonialism, to the rise of, to the emergence of Zionism as a colonial movement, settler colonial movement in Palestine. It's very linked to that danger emanating from that movement. particularly in the 19th, 20s, and 30s under the British mandate, where it was kind of clear, or clear to some poets at least, emerging at that time, that Palestine is facing a serious danger of colonization by Zionism, which happened, so they foresaw it. And perhaps one of the first people, and if one wants really to pinpoint exactly who is the first one to be the Palestinian poet, it's quite hard, because there were like several people from Palestine who belonged to various movements in the broader Arab world. So they have Zajal, for example, which is kind of popular forms of songs. But poetry in the form that is known traditionally by, I would say, Ibrahim Tawqan is perhaps one of the first early Palestinian poets, his poetry was very mature, remarkably linked to the Arabic tradition, but also very anchored in the Palestinian experience, highlighting the danger of Zionism, the danger of colonialism, and also critiquing and attacking British colonialism in Palestine and the violent methods it used and destroyed much of Palestinian society at that time in the 30s, and so on and so forth. So we really start to have the first serious poetic stirring about Palestine in relation to the Palestinian question in the 30s under British colonial rule. And later on, obviously, we have various poets, some of whom died in the cause of fighting for Palestine, like Abdul Rahim Mahmoud, a remarkable poet who was killed in the Battle of Al-Qastal in Jerusalem. And other poets who also emerged during that time, like Abu Salma and others.
Yeah, and speaking of poets who were targeted and martyred, now everyone knows Rifat Al-Arir at age 44. He was in December 23. He was killed in Gaza and by the occupying forces, and his poem "If I Must Die" went viral. But as you say, Atef, it's not the first time that Palestinian writers, poets are targeted, killed, and martyred. Could you talk about the importance of words and poetry and what really drives Palestinian poetry in modern day? Because as you said, it was before the anticipated colonialism, but now it's sort of, we have occupation and apartheid. And what are the themes and ideas that modern day Palestinian poets and writers focus on?
I think to start with the point that what drives Palestinian poetry, basically, I think there's a huge realization on the part of Palestinian writers and poets in particular, that Palestinians, they don't really have very much by way of concrete power. And somehow, throughout the history of the Arab world, language has been an emblem of expression, obviously, but of power somehow, the power of this Arab civilization, which really goes back in time. So it's tapping into this incredible resource to express their emotions and their predicament and their situation in the face of such harsh fates that they had faced. And therefore, much of Palestinian poetry right from the beginning has been about describing Palestine and sort of reconfiguring it after particularly its loss through poetry, finding a way of portraying Palestinian lives, Palestinian suffering, and also celebrating the landscape, celebrating Palestinian commitment and attachment to their land. This is a huge theme that goes back in time, and also reflecting on exile. Exile was also one of the major themes that we find in Palestinian poetry, and the heartache and suffering that comes from losing your home or losing your land to effectively strangers who really manufactured a narrative which has no basis in reality. But nonetheless, it's a narrative that is backed by superpowers and repeated endlessly by the media. So the Palestinians have attempted to, through sort of reference and through their understanding of that tradition through exquisite sort of composition and language to portray their innermost feelings in relation to their conditions and what happened to them, which is, as you know, I mean, you mentioned Rafat al-Arair has been extraordinary, and the fact that he has managed to, in the last moment, to write that poem and to tweet it, and others such as Hiba Abu Nada, who was also martyred early on during this genocide in Gaza, reflecting on Gaza and her last word as poetry, her legacy that we are very grateful for, is what she has left for us in terms of words that convey the common aspirations of the Palestinian people in a nationhood, in dignity, in peace, in safety. All of these things that are denied to the Palestinians have been reflected upon in their poetry. And it's been really an extraordinary journey.
It's very powerful. And you mentioned exile. Your family lives in Gaza, and around 75 to 80% of Palestinians living in Gaza are Palestinian refugees. And not many people know that. Could you share your family's diaspora story from Palestine, how this shaped your identity, your work, and if there was a pivotal experience or moment or something that influenced your journey into poetry and literature?
I mean, as for my direct family, we are refugees descended from, the city, we can go back in time, but I think the last city that my family lived in was Beersheba, which is Beir Saba, in what is now called Israel. And we have lost our homes there and everything that we had, my grandfather and my father, who was born there too, and moved to Gaza, like most the people of Gaza come from villages and towns and cities of what became later Israel. So we are from there. As for me personally, it's really, I have realized when I was at Birzeit how important poetry and literature to Palestinians, and how important to us to study it as a source to highlight our conditions. And I think it became very important to me as I realized that this is perhaps a source that has the most profoundest reflection upon the Palestinian conditions, in such a way that no other form of expression perhaps comes close to doing that. So realizing that and having studied English literature, I also realized that this is a very mature tradition. It's not just like sort of underdeveloped or lacking in sophistication in terms of technicality, formulaic technicality. It's a very mature tradition, and it refers to this, it's linked to this incredible tradition that I referred to earlier. So I thought, this was, and I was moved by it, the thing that moved me most. So I felt very attached to it, and reading many Palestinian poets, I thought it's a way to tell the Palestinian story, to stay close to it. And to when I left Palestine in 2003, it's just a commitment and loyalty on my part to Palestine as my people, but also as an idea for justice, for humanity, and for hope ultimately.
Mm. And personally, were you always a reader? Were you somebody that as a child you loved stories or writing, or how did you find that path? Because it as you say, it becomes something about advocacy, but it's kind of it's almost unusual, especially sometimes in Eastern cultures, to have that be the focus.
Well, I was definitely a reader in Gaza. I mean, when I was in my secondary school, it wasn't, particularly poetry, but it was just language. I was interested in language. And I, sometimes even I used to enjoy reading Freud, just accidentally, something that spoke to my inner world and responded to it somehow, something I was searching for. And also the Arabic tradition, including the Quran, I was just enchanted by the language, and that it's something very unique and something that spoke to me personally. And then obviously realizing the national, the communal, the humane value of it all, then it became a commitment in relation to these kind of values, if you'd like, that would draw me to it. But I was a reader in Gaza, and I was very interested at school in Rafah, in the south of Gaza, which is just now been lying in ruins as we see the pictures of our family returning to what was their homes. So when I was there, I particularly at the last stage of my schooling in Gaza, I became very fascinated with language. And it made me read more and more into the Arabic tradition, the European tradition. And then later on, formalizing it in terms of studying at Birzeit University and being interested in literature and linguistics too.
Yeah.
And Atef, let's briefly talk about Palestinian history. Because as we know, Zionism is a race ideology and it's rooted in settler colonialism. And it's been seeking to dehumanize and to erase us Palestinians, our existence, our identity. But we're seeing more and more Jewish communities distancing themselves from Zionism and its ethno-supremacist project. Can you share your thoughts? Because your family is from there, you grew up there, and you live in the West, and you talk about the power of poetry and words. Can you share your thoughts on the Zionist ideology and its impact on both the Palestinian and the Jewish communities globally and in Palestine?
I think the Zionist ideology, I've read quite a bit on this topic. The Zionist ideology, I think, really is not only a settler colony, that it aims to replace a native population and take its place, as it has been trying, and it managed in certain cases, to build a nation, to construct Israel, which didn't exist, before. So I think from the beginning, it's a settler colonial movement that has been backed by certain superpowers, the UK first, and then later on the United States and other European countries. But it's also a genocidal movement right from the get-go, right from its inception, that it basically realizes there are various statements and saying that in order for it to build this state, in order for it to construct this settler colonial state, it has to destroy the local population, the native Arab Palestinian population. And it did that. And I think in relation to the Jewish community, what is remarkable is that you have certain voices throughout the history of Zionism, which basically crystallizes more and more in the 19th century. You have stirrings of it earlier, but in the 19th century, it becomes clearer what this movement is about. You have certain Jewish voices, particularly intellectual Jewish voices, that start to reject it because they see it as sort of it's in contradiction to basically human values, in light of which they read the Bible, they read their scripture. And later on, you have very vociferous, very clear voices, such as Freud, for example, Einstein, the really remarkable figures of the Jewish community, seeing in it as sort of transforming the religion into a nationalist, supremacist, fascistic kind of thing, at the expense of a population that already exists there, and that its claims for civilization are all bogus. I mean, we've seen how they treat Palestinian prisoners yesterday when they are let out. I mean, they're in such a terrible state after a year or so in Palestinian prison, in Israeli prisons. So the Jewish community, and there was a very interesting book that I read at one point called A Century of Jewish Opposition to Zionism, by a rabbi from Canada called Yaakov Rapkin, which I actually recommend, because it does show how Zionism manipulated the scripture and everything in order to construct a narrative for itself as sort of nativist to the land of Palestine, which it is not. It's a very European phenomenon emerging from within the history of Europe, and existing at the expense of the Palestinians, and aiming, and not only aiming, but actually practicing genocide throughout its history. for the purpose of eradicating the Palestinian from their own homeland, which is extraordinary and really sad and painful when one thinks of what just happened in Gaza recently. But it very much, it's in sort of, it fits with the pattern of Zionism as a movement that is not interested in coexistence. It's not interested in normality. It's not interested in peace, but interested in supremacy, domination. And some of its early figures, David Ben-Gurion, Jabotinsky, other figures who Netanyahu and his fascist cohort in Israel are very, very linked to epistemologically, intellectually, and so on. They realized they were very, very vocal about power being their method, force being their method, force and the use of more force and creating more pain and suffering for the native population so that it's forced to leave Palestine. And that's unfortunately the sad thing. It's been aided and abetted by European powers who basically helped Zionism to manufacture that narrative and to make it a reality on the ground, which is a reality of supremacy, domination, and genocide and destruction, ultimately, as we see so clearly in Gaza.
Yeah. I'll tell you what else is important to the Zionists, apart from force, is words.
Yes.
You mentioned the narratives that they've constructed over time, but also, I think of the slogan, "A land without a people for a people without a land." I mean, it was an easy way to feed the PR, ignoring the fact that there were so many people, Palestinians, who are being erased, massacred, literally physically erased off the land. Let's talk about that propaganda and the importance of words, because why are Palestinian poets targeted in a genocide? There is a strength to words and the discussion and the enduring resilience and sumud of Palestinians that is put into words that seems to really drive Zionists crazy, or drive any fascist entity crazy when people resist using words. Can you talk about that sort of resistance and that culture within the poetry and writing?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think words and the use of words and poetry and later on novels really are a very powerful tool for the Palestinians. And I think Israelis, because the way they depicted the Palestinians is either that this land was inhabited, but it's basically they're uncivilized, they don't have a culture, and it's something that they have tapped into until today. If you see the narrative of Netanyahu recently in this disgraceful speech in front of the American Congress, which he ad nauseum repeats. It's always talking about civilization. We are civilized, we are the barbarians. In fact, it's just the complete opposite, because of what is the measure of civilization? Is respect for a human life, which he absolutely doesn't have. So I think words from the beginning, the Israelis, they feared Palestinian voice. Why was, for example, one of the early poets of Palestine, Mahmoud Darwish, imprisoned repeatedly? For what? For writing poems. For example, I'm just reminded of the example yesterday, Isra Berri from Jenin. She was just released in this hostage swap, Palestinian hostages, Palestinian prisoners yesterday. The woman from Jenin, she was a poet. She was imprisoned for writing poetry. Dareen Tartour, so many. Ghassan Kanafani, killed for writing novels. So many, Hiba Abu Nada. And in fact, in the genocide in Gaza throughout this last year, poets were systematically targeted. Why? Because they have touched the hearts of the world with their truth. I mean, poetry is a very condensed form of truth, told in such an exquisite, beautiful, truthful, touching way. And therefore, it fights that. It doesn't want the Palestinian to have a narrative. It doesn't want the Palestinian to have a voice. It doesn't want the Palestinian to have memories. It doesn't want them to have any kind of expression that exposes their ugly crimes. And that's what poetry has done. And it's done it. What is remarkable about the Palestinian, it really has to be emphasized. it is done it so humanely. It's not an exclusivist poetry. It's not, of course, you'll find odd poems here and there, but as a generally, as a tradition, it's been remarkably truthful. It's been beautiful. It's very grounded in tradition. It's often very learned. It's just very touching. And I think the Israelis, I mean, that's why Ariel Sharon at one point said, I envy the Palestinians for having somebody like Mahmoud Darwish. And they, for example, have banned people in Israel from studying Palestinian poetry, Palestinian poetry in particular. You have some like departments like Islamic studies, where they just want to highlight particular ideological aspects, or they might study, like, for example, certain poems here and there that have particular connotations that are quite narrow and limited. But the humane value and the political value of Palestinian poetry and the national aspirations of Palestinian poetry, of Palestinians as reflected in poetry, are excluded. It's almost like always the Israelis are attempting to have this veil over Palestinian poetry as a limited, primitive something, that is just divesting it of its importance. And I think the Palestinians have succeeded, I would say, in terms of having a voice, particularly through poetry in the world. And we see many people now read Palestinian poetry. It's taught at universities, it's discussed, it's analyzed. There should be more of that, clearly, but it has been an incredible source of resistance against Israeli, attempts to eradicate the Palestinians as people, as voice, as narrative, etc., as memories.
Yeah, no, exactly. And actually, I don't know if you had the same experience, but since the 15 months ago in Gaza, I think a lot of people in the West have just kind of discovered Palestine or find Palestinian history too complex, or say they've been fed the narrative of the Zionists for too long. So could you could you maybe simplify or give us an overview of Palestinian history, and also any books on poetry or any books that people should be reading to kind of get them exposed and to give them a flavor of our culture and history?
I mean, Palestinian history, in terms of particularly, let's say, literature, it begins in the 30s mainly, and I've described some aspects of it, particularly with Ibrahim Tawqan. And then you have, after the Nakba of 1948 and the Palestinians being dispersed and facing the harsh conditions that they did as refugees, then you have almost a disappearance of the Palestinian nation, forced disappearance, clearly. And then you have, in the 60s, the Palestinian rising as a national movement. And here, poets were very instrumental. You think about Palestinian poets such as Mahmoud Darwish, Fadwa Tawqan, Samih al-Qasim, Abu Salma al-Karmi, remarkable poets who really started to raise the consciousness of Palestinians, of the Arab world, of their national rights and aspirations. And you have very gifted poets, particularly Mahmoud Darwish, who sort of become a celebrity in the Arab world. He read very widely. And from there on, it also coincided, this period, the 60s and 70s, coincided with a kind of renaissance in poetry in the Arab world. You have, for the first time, the free verse movement emerging in Iraq, in Egypt, and the Palestinian poets tapping into that and becoming pioneers of it quite quickly, actually. So it was a time for poetry, a time for expression, deep expression. And that evolves, they were very young poets. Luckily, Mahmoud Darwish, Samih al-Qasim, Zayyad, Tawfiq Zayyad, they were quite young then, and they kept writing poetry. And many Arab poets, such as Amal Donqol in Egypt, Adonis in Syria, Nizar Qabbani, Badr Shakir Sayyab, particularly Badr Shakir Sayyab a bit earlier, but all of them, they were influenced, they were moved by that movement. And you have this echoing, it's almost like an orchestra poetry, if you would like, from across the Arab world, all concerned and all focusing on Palestine. as a case, where to reclaim the homeland, to reclaim the nation that was taken. And then you have a development of poetry, particularly in the 1980s, where you have the massacre, Sabra and Shatila, after Israel invaded Beirut in 1982, and epic poems emerging from that situation by Mahmoud Darwish, Ghassan Zaqata, and other Palestinian poets. And that journey continues. Particularly through what emerged as the national poet of Palestine, Mahmoud Darwish, who became, very well known in the Arab world. And then in the 90s, you have a situation which is kind of new, because you have Oslo, and Oslo affected the Palestinian form of expression and affected poetry, because it fragmented the Palestinians. It divided them between those who agreed with the agreement and those who were suspicious of it. And you have poetry that becomes more concerned with the individual. But the individual is always, in the case of Palestine, is sort of related to the collective condition. So throughout the 90s, you have a change in the form of expression, but still anchored in the Palestinian experience, collective experience, up to now, basically. But these are the key stages, I would say. The pre-Nakba stage, the 1960s, the emergence of the national movement, and then after Beirut and the Oslo Agreement in 1993, these are key stages of Palestinian poetry, and in fact, Palestinian literature more broadly, in terms of its changes. And you have key poets. I mean, recently I'm reminded of absolutely remarkable poems by Ibrahim Nasrallah, which has just been sung in quite a big orchestra. Very, very, really reminiscent of great epics that tell the story of Gaza through such a condensed form of expression to an international audience, linking music and poetry together, which is quite unprecedented, but very, very effective and very moving. In terms of books, I would say perhaps one of the really early books that emerged, which goes back a long time ago, if one wants to go back in history, find a small volume, Victims of the Map, which include the three key Palestinian poets. And Adonis was not a Palestinian poet, Syrian. But later on, you have the works of Salma Jayousi, who's been an extraordinary chronicler of Palestinian literature, the Palestinian Anthology of Poetry. Really very, very important work in the 90s. For what it's worth, I have a volume, you mentioned it earlier, called The Map of Absence, Palestinian Writing on the Nakba, which documents some key milestones of Palestinian poetry and examples of it, and include other forms of writing, mainly excerpts from novels and memoirs and so on. So there's just some of the books, but there are so many. Obviously, if one wants to read Mahmoud Darwish specifically, there's The Butterfly's Burden, is a very good book, translated so ably by Fadi Judah. I would recommend The Butterfly's Burden. It's a very, very beautiful book. A very good book to read is Murid al-Barghouti. Not exactly poetry, it's prose, but really the most stirring existential account of the Palestinian in a form which is literary, called I Saw Ramallah. Quite an extraordinary book. There are just so many out there, so many out there.
Thank you.
Of Ghassan Zaqatan, for example, are very moving too. Najwan Darwish, I've recently translated a volume by him called Embrace. Very, very moving poetry, very beautiful.
Yeah, wonderful. That's really helpful. Thank you.
I love well, I don't love the idea, but it's interesting, this map of absence idea, because going back to when the map was drawn in, split in two arbitrarily by the UN, which at that time in 1947 was only 33 countries that partitioned Palestine, gave away 56% of its land to the Zionists. And of course, in 1948, with the Nakba, the Zionists expanded to take 78% of historical Palestine. My question is around that, because not many people know, and I'm ashamed that I didn't know until not that long ago, that in March 1949, less than a year later, 37 countries voted to admit the Zionist settler colony of Israel into the UN, based on three conditions. which was the right of return for all Palestinian refugees, equal rights to citizens within 1948 Palestine, and for Jerusalem to be a corpus separatum, like its own area. And here we are 77 years later, not one of these conditions has been fulfilled, and it is never discussed on the international stage. So there's sort of this rogue state element of the way Israel has behaved. Why is there no accountability, do you think? I mean, we have our ideas. How should we reform or think about the international system to be different ongoing?
Well, I mean, exactly. I think, you and I perhaps have similar ideas because it's just very logical to draw such conclusion. Israel, without this support, this blind support by colonial imperial powers, no matter what it did and what it does by way of destruction and killing and violence, vile practices, it's always been supported by the colonial powers such as Britain in the past. And it realized that. I mean, so many of the Zionists earlier on realized, to have that state, it has to be supported by a superpower because it's put in the Middle East amidst these Arab countries. It doesn't belong there. It just essentially doesn't belong there. So it's sort of put slab in the middle there. With no relation with them, no friendly relation, no matter how many offers it has been given. And it's been imposed through sheer power, force, nothing else. And then the US basically coming in, aligning itself, interest, ideology, so many narratives. Palestinians have faced these incredible manufactured narratives which are totally untrue by these superpowers and the media corporations that support them, that gave Zionists a state in a country, Arab Palestinian country, to them, to those strangers who have built this quite powerful state, nuclear state, which is above the law. And it continues to be so. And it's never shown a shred of interest in integrating itself into the region. It just wants to take its resources, to dominate, and to sort of just constantly showing contempt and disregard to the native population of Palestine and indeed to the Arab world, as we saw in Syria recently and Lebanon and so on and so forth. So I think the Zionist narrative, the Zionist state, which should be dismantled, absolutely, would not have, and I don't mean dismantled, killed or violently, that's not what I mean. There's got to be a humane solution, but I mean, the Zionist ideology of supremacy and domination has got to end. It would not have existed without the support of the UK as an colonial power before, and the US later on. And we've seen throughout the war, its war, attack, this genocide in Gaza, how the United States has stood so unjustly with Israel, supplying it endlessly with weapons to kill children, to kill women, all documented, shown, streamed live on TV, and without any accountability, shielding it from accountability in the United Nations. So it's been really quite a harrowing situation, a harrowing story. And this Israel has no legitimacy whatsoever in Palestine, and it's lost legitimacy even further, if it has any, by this evil attack on Palestinians that, and again, I use the word evil here in the secular sense, the attack against the Palestinians in such a systematic, very barbaric way to destroy a community like that, supported by the US and by the media corporations that completely eradicated or have shown no regard to the Palestinian narrative, to their suffering, to their children, to the fact that they are natives to the land. So I think, there's the partition, the British were interested in partition in India. They orchestrated it. They were interested in partition in Palestine. They were the masters of They were the powerful state at that time, and made it, created the conditions for it. But they never gave the Palestinian, or were interested in the Palestinian Arab population as people. They were never interested in their aspirations in terms of national political aspirations. And because of that disregard, this fundamental disregard, this problem festered. It's never been solved, because they were always like a secondary to the Zionists. It's like the Zionists are the core, are the most important, are the normative, that's how the discourse has been. And the Arab Palestinians are secondary, peripheral to this story. And the extraordinary thing is that the Palestinians are actually the natives of that land. There's always been there. They have it goes back in history. They have continuous, uninterrupted living on that land. And that's been the extraordinary kind of narratives but I think it's been shown for what it is, that it is settler colonial, it's genocidal, it's violent, and it's inhumane. And I think this latest destruction of Gaza will be recorded as a shameful milestone towards the end and dismantling of Zionism.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you, Atef. And since we're talking about Gaza, and the ceasefire started yesterday, the 19th of January, we've seen the ceasefire in Lebanon, and they continued their bombings, so that hasn't stopped. So let's see if it stops. I think many people don't realize, and you said the condition of the Palestinian prisoners who were, and the hostages, really, they're hostages, because those who were released were women and children. But something not many people know is that Palestinians aren't allowed to celebrate the release of the hostages. Maybe you can talk a bit about that. And then if we go back to 15 months when Al Ahli hospital was first bombed in Gaza in October, also 23, there was an outcry from the world and people. That was the first hospital to be bombed. Of course, the Zionists blamed it on our side. But they, of course, that became very evident that they did the bombings, and they continued to bomb hospital after hospital in Gaza. They identify doctors, ambulances, medics, health workers, and your wife is a doctor from Gaza, and of course, you live in London now. But can you also talk about the targeting not only of poets but also of the medical sector, and how does she and her colleagues feel about it? And basically, just talk us through your thoughts on that.
I think this has really been devastating. The targeting of hospitals, medical facilities in Gaza, which were already, before 7th of October, they were already on their knees. There was shortage in medicine, so many people begging constantly to be taken out, to be patients to be treated outside because of lack of this and that medicine. So many, so many aspects that needed to be addressed for the medical community in Gaza, and they were not addressed and not dealt with. So when 7th of October happened, and after that, you have this systematic targeting of hospitals. And I think the attack against the Ahli hospital in Gaza, it was like shock and awe. We sort of establish a norm, and then we see how the world reacts. And the world reacted, Biden so shamefully, would go on history down as one of the most shameful moments, laying the blames on the Palestinians when it was clearly an Israeli attack that killed and maimed over 400 people. And then they went on and they destroyed Shifa Hospital completely, the biggest medical complex in Palestine, actually. And they went on, they destroyed a hospital where my wife used to work, Muhammad Yusuf al-Najjar. I saw images of it yesterday. It's a shell of itself. There's no hospital anymore, completely destroyed. They destroyed Al Kuwaiti Hospital in the middle of Rafah. The Khan Yunis Hospital, they destroyed part of it. So many medical Kamal Adwan. We don't know where the whereabouts of Hussam Abu Safiya, a remarkable Palestinian doctor, the doctor from Al Auda Hospital, who the head of Al Auda Hospital in Jabalia, it's unfortunate that I forgot his name. So many Palestinian doctors, over 1,000 Palestinian doctors, have been, well, either killed or injured or imprisoned. Munir al-Burj raped to death in Israeli prison.
That's disgusting.
Disgusting. The list goes on and on. This is absolute barbarity. This is absolute barbarity, and it has to be recognized and seen for what it is. And every doctor I've spoken with, I mean, there are some friends of my wife who would be doctor friends, like Dr. Razan. She's been killed. She's got a child now with her husband. Her husband was also killed, doctor. So many doctors that we know, I don't know personally because I haven't lived in Gaza for a long time, but my wife does. And they have been killed. And it's just an incredibly sad and harrowing story, because really Palestinians, they bore their heart and soul into educating people to become doctors, to help the community, to keep the community surviving in Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and inside Israel. Palestinians, doctors have played a key role in the survival of the Palestinians. And Israelis know that. That's why they have targeted them, because they don't want that survival from the beginning, and they don't want it anymore. Like now, they don't want. That's why they've targeted systematically, and not only the doctors, but also their families. So many young doctors too were killed. They know how many years it takes to train a doctor, to become proficient, to become really good at their jobs, and therefore this absolute evil attack. And again, evil in the secular sense, violent, basically, attack against doctors systematically to destroy the medical infrastructure, limited as it is, and to reduce it to rubble in certain cases. It's been an extraordinary thing that the world has allowed this to happen and has watched it happening, while Israel manufacturing really ludicrous statements, which media has sometimes, kind of defended or put forward as legitimate, like that hospitals are used as a human shields. And there's not one shred of evidence, to suggest this has been the case.
Yeah.
Not one evidence that any Palestinian hospitals in Gaza has been used for kind of military purposes. And even if this was the case, and there was a case, like even if there's this, it just doesn't justify the destruction of a community inside a hospital, essentially a community of doctors, patients. We've seen the most harrowing stories, and I think the world has to see this practice as one of the most shameful, if not the most shameful, episode in human history, that you have that systematic attack against the medical community in Gaza, and this destruction of the medical facilities to the point that people have no recourse to medical treatment. It's just against any basic standard of decency, of humanity.
Sorry, I got muted myself. It's again that dehumanization makes it easier to commit these atrocities, which brings me back to the importance of writing, the importance of poetry and representation in speaking about Palestinians as humans and reclaiming them as humans, which shouldn't have to be done, but that's important, presumably.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's the main thing, is really to highlight the humanity of the Palestinians. And, I mean, we have seen so many stories, I mean, of Palestinian humanity and generosity in humanity.
Yeah.
We have but the trouble is that Israeli narrative and of course, when I say Israeli narrative, there are some individuals within Israel who are perfectly decent, and Gideon Levy and some people in Haaretz, but I mean as a system, and what they have normalized in that society by way of fascism, to see the Palestinians as subhuman. This has been from the beginning the Zionist way of justifying their theft of the land and their theft of resources. And what poetry and literature in Palestine has done is to highlight the rootedness, the normalcy, the humanity of the Palestinians. And they're like, I mean, I'm not saying they're ideal community. There's no such thing. But there are people really who have shown remarkable resilience in the face of such attempts to destroy them. And they have tried again and again and shown examples of a humanization. We have Khalid Nabhan, who was killed recently, this sheikh, this remarkable story of a man who was kind to his people, like normal, like decent, and he's been targeted because they don't want faces like that.
Yeah.
You have so many stories like
Khaled, I think, with the beard, right? And with
yes,
his
yes,
daughter. Yes, he became
exactly. Wael al-Dahduh, the journalist. So many of we haven't spoken of this, so many of the journalists.
Yes.
They just incinerated them. They killed so many of them, their families, because they don't want to see human faces, or they want to see people being reduced, running after water, running after food, queuing up for basic, rations, and constantly demanding, basic stuff, reduced them to very human, like animal kind of instincts, and taking away their humanity. And I think what the Palestinians have shown is that they have stuck to their humanity. I think that's very important. And they're, in their poetry, in their literature, it's I would say generally it's not exclusivist, it's humane, and it's very inspiring too. And that's very important, again, because ultimately Palestine, and that's a deep hope and a wish, obviously, it will outlive and outlast Zionism. Zionism is an ugly episode in the history of Palestine in terms of colonization and theft of it. And Palestine as an idea, as people will outlive this idea. And hopefully humanity will prevail. But obviously it's a dark time, a chapter in terms of the people who have been killed by Zionism and Israeli colonialism. And hopefully it won't be long, but it is very painful, meanwhile, to see the suffering of our people and their destruction in the form that we've seen.
No, I agree. And the narrative is slowly changing, Atef, as you say, and we need to imagine a different future for change to happen. I think that's where poetry, writing, stories are very, very important. But people with a strong sense of humanism are protesting. They're raising their voices in solidarity with Palestine, boycotting Zionism and governments that support them. Not as much as we'd like, but more and more. And I think the Palestinian movement has become a global movement. And really keeping the momentum is very important because there's a bigger issue here. It's not only we need justice. We can't have peace without justice. And activism takes many forms. So I was wondering if how ordinary people can make a difference and do extraordinary things. What advice, what can you share for people who are kind of feeling down or depressed or feel they're not able to do much to make a difference and a meaningful impact, if you like?
I think it's really been amazing to see people from all walks of life marching and protesting almost on a weekly basis against the genocide in Gaza. And I think, although I felt despair so many times because my family is there, so many from my family have been killed, their house is gone. So despair is a natural reaction to such, darkness and such situation where when the horizons are become so limited and so narrow. But I think what's been so extraordinary is to see this eruption of protest against Zionism, against this ideology, this exclusivist, destructive, genocidal ideology, supremacist ideology, and saying no to such a thing, and no to such violence, no to cutting off water, fuel, food from the people of Gaza and Palestine more broadly. No to the destruction of infrastructure, to this collective punishment imposed on the Palestinians, to the siege. And I think it's grown more and more because people see Palestinians as human beings who have rights, who have aspirations, and who really love their land and want to stay on their land and sacrifice so much for their land. So I think more people should not despair whatever situation Zionism creates on the ground, as it were. And I think this ceasefire, limited as it is, and fragile, perhaps the word fragile as it is more than, it would not have come ultimately without this collective international protest against the genocide. So we need to keep documenting it. People need to work in coordination with each other to help at the charity level to donate to major. There are very remarkable charities doing really good work for the education of Gazans. I was involved in, I was so happy to see, I was at a conference in Glasgow, so happy to see so many initiatives of making sure students will graduate from the universities. This requires activism, requires support from civil society, from individuals. I was very happy to be at a conference at SOAS, which was discussing the destruction of the heritage in Gaza and the rebuilding of museums in Gaza, and to see there are actually plans put in place for, once this is possible, to rebuild the heritage sites, because there's very good documentation of these heritage sites. So I think, and then the protest in the street, although the government, there is a chasm between the government and the people in the West vis-a-vis the Palestinian issue, because of the Zionist propaganda, because of the lingering, the fear atmosphere that they have established through the accusation of anti-Semitism, which is, often not true, and in fact contrary to this. Because of that, you have people who have been afraid because they go after their livelihoods, they go after their jobs, etc., etc. But I think it's important to keep protesting and to realize that ultimately a victory, and I mean victory in the humane sense for the Palestinians, is a victory for humanity. We have seen this story over 100 years, how much this population has been targeted, but still it has survived and also thrived in certain cases. And the world needs to support them because their governments sometimes have taken an active part in the creation of Zionism, the maintenance of Zionism, and the covering up for the crimes of Zionism. So we need people to be active wherever, in whichever field they can be active: education, heritage, culture, political protest. Just keep going, and it's really been very inspiring to see all of these forms of protest and opposition to the genocide.
Well, I think that's a really hopeful point to end on, actually, because I think that sometimes we feel powerless in the face of these big governments making decisions for us. But I can see over the past year how much BDS, how much protests, and all of these kinds of things have made a difference. And change requires good people, to do something, however small and within their world. So thank you for that hopeful ending. And thank you also, Atef, for your eloquence and your invaluable insights today. I'm sorry that we don't have much more time, but we really are so impressed with your dedication, your activism, your beautiful work in the field of poetry. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to please subscribe to us, share it with as many people as you can. And we will put links to some of Atef's books in the show notes.
And stories and representation matter. Stay informed, stay engaged. Please take action in solidarity. See you next time. And just to say a big, big thank you, Atef. Palestine needs more people like you. So thank you for today.
No, thank you so much. It's really great to meet you both. And yes, wish you all the best with this amazing work you're doing. It's really very important. And it couldn't have come at a better time. So keep going. We all should keep going somehow.
Absolutely.
Really appreciate it. A wonderful opportunity.
We will.
Thank you,
Thank
Atif.
so much.
Tislam. Thank you again.